Hi, can I be heard? Oh,
Yes.
great. I'll take PYs in chat. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Secession has always been a question written in blood, and we don't think the situation will be any different. 3 things in this speech. 1, why assuming succession succeeds, it would be bad. 2, why the process of secession itself would be violent and fraught with danger. And thirdly, why we're likely to have improvements in the future, assuming we don't secede. I have 2 responses. The first response is towards their broad line of argumentation that currently East Malaysia, if they seceded, would be quite successful at it, and West Malaysia would rely on them quite a bit. If West Malaysia is incredibly reliant on the natural resources of the East, if it is the case that to some degree the East gives them more than they get back, we think it is for these very same reasons that you're likely to see an increase in investment for public infrastructure, representation, and some increase in the autonomy of the federated territories of Sabah and Sarawak in the first place, for the very same reason that they say, which is that if Sarawak and Sabah get better and perform better, then West Malaysia does better off, which is why there's an incentive for them like to return things like, for example, special autonomy rights, which are already gradually in the process of doing so right now. So that's the broad first point. I'd like to point that the problems they've outlined in their case are the same reasons for why we're likely to see solvency without the extreme methods of secession that cross a hard line you can never take back. That's the end of the first response. The second response is they say there are incentives to do the secession well because they want to keep amicable ties. I first want to make the observation that these amicable ties only happens after they have seceded, but the process of secession itself is likely to drastically increase the tensions and danger that the political system will experience, both because this will be seen as a failure on the part of the national government, but also because they will try and attempt to stop you from doing this, as you've seen in basically every other secessionary attempt in the world. Having advanced these responses, first argument, we believe secession will be bad, assuming that this argument immediately engages with the best case of government bench. First, economically, it would be terrible, and we have 3 mechanisms why. The first thing is that they would have to spend substantially more on for them to make money from their industries. So we agree the industries are like oil and natural gas, palm oil, timber, and so on. And these typically go to West Malaysia to be refined and go through their ports and go through their bureaucracies. But the problem is that you have to go not only through a massive process of overhauling, which would require billions of ringgit in order for you to be able to successfully do, you also for a moment in time lose basically your entire market because you have to sell to totally new people who are unsure if you'll be able to credibly make commitments to selling to them. So the first thing is that you just don't get access to the industry you've been reliant on for so many years. Secondly, investments would flee the country out of fear because the process of secession is profoundly risky for businessmen. That is to say, there's no guarantee what it would look like, no guarantee how strong the currency will be, no guarantee what the labor force will look like in this country. And as such, there's no guarantee for many of these investments. Instead, they would likely look to alternative places where you could look for many of these raw resources again, like maybe in other places of the world, right? So you just think there are plenty of alternatives that these people would go to. You lose massively on billions of dollars of investment that would be necessary to provide people with jobs, food, and stuff on the table. Thirdly is that we also think that you lose the support of the mainland government. For the same reasons we outlined earlier, we think that they're likely in the future, or at the very least in the present, to receive billions of ringgit for things like infrastructure development that they get tax from the more service-oriented industries in the mainland that they would not have access to otherwise. Heavily reliant, not only do they heavily fluctuate, which means that they need a relatively more stable service-oriented industry to provide them resources and goods so that they can continuously provide public services to individuals, which you would now no longer have because you lose that as a part of the tax base. You also receive substantially more risk, again, for the previous 2 reasons we outlined earlier. As such, you are less likely to be able to put food on the table, make a living wage, and access basic rights on government bench. First observation, economic might simply takes precedence because it is a precondition to your ability to access basic rights that are fundamental to you being happy, you accessing agency. For you to have that agency in the first place, you must simply be alive and must simply be able to go to school and access public support and benefits. As a second observation, this is also the means by which they access other important rights. Being able to lobby in national government or being able to have a functioning democratic state relies on that state itself being capable of providing for the needs of its people. There's no matter if, like, yes, they might have imperfect access to democratic rights in Malaysia, but there's no guarantee that assuming that they succeeded, that the government would be able to be actualizing these rights, assuming that they actually did succeed. That's the end of the first point, and we prove that people would starve if you chose to secede. But secondly, I also like to make the observation that they would likely fail after secession because the Malaysian Federation would gain more allies relative to you and would attempt to compete at every step, especially because business investments would be unlikely to enter you because they're perceived to be risky, and you're in a bad position to negotiate deals because they know your risk, leave that place, and you are desperate to leave this country. That means that countries like China and Russia will know that you are desperate and are likely to offer you less preferential deals. So I'll take the POI from closing government. Go.
Do you think it's legitimate for citizens to trade off economic rights in favor of things that they think are more important?
You know, that's a good question. We'll answer that in the second argument, not in your speech. So we also think that the process of secession would itself be bad, right? So regardless of whether or not they have the capacity to make the trade-off will unlikely be capable of succeeding in giving them these rights. Why? We think the process of secession is likely to fail and cause violence for a few reasons. One, this is it's likely to be unpopular because it's a politically turbulent time already. They're going through a political crisis. It's unlikely to be incredibly expensive, overhauling the energy infrastructure in the country, having to start finding the funds to maintain public services. And people have established links with people from West Malaysia. Like they have friends there. Not everybody from Sabah and Sarawak would like to leave. That's the first point. It's just likely to be unpopular, not likely to gain meaningful support. And you're making this decision on behalf of everyone in these areas. But secondly, is that you're likely to receive massive blockages from Malaysia. For example, why? You're likely to experience massive blockages from Malaysia. Why? First of all, this would be seen as a failure of the government to keep unity in times of crisis. Secondly, it would be a loss of all the things that government wants, that a government said that Malaysia wants. Exactly. So they lose lots of money and resources trying to keep you. This is likely to be called as high treason or attempting to undermine the state, where even reasonably liberal states like Spain have committed violence against people who simply wanted to speak out, which means that assuming that they can make the trade-off doesn't actualize in something meaningful. Beyond that, this is likely to be seen as an existential threat specifically to Malaysia, which have already been seen to silence political dissent in other ways, such as opening up investigations to activists such as the editor of Code Blue, or revoking work permits for people who spoke up against you, or things like raiding journalists like Malaya Kini, right? So these are all things. That realistically that provide a trend for why Malaysia would be likely to execute and attempt to exercise violence against your individuals. Beyond that, though, the specific Prime Minister Jacob is currently in a desperate position, and they don't want to have to risk another political crisis after just getting elected, which is why they would seek to clamp down on political dissent, which means that they would likely shoot protesters. They would likely do things like make it difficult for you to get access to polls, so that the secession would be seen as illegitimate. Broadly speaking, this would attract conflict and violence both from the state, but also from outside actors such as the Moral National Liberation Front or the Royal Sulu Army, who would see this as an opportunity to break open conflict and see this as a time to ferment dissent and discord within the area. So we think this creates a politically unfavorable time for individuals that causes broad violence. That means that the trade-off itself is actually far more than what you asked for. So not only would it be broadly illegitimate, it would also mean that your life is likely to be far worse. And earlier the Malaysia year, but also because they're currently facing scrutiny over the COVID response, where to the point where the PM was forced to resign due to the effects of hunger on the people. The current government will be forced to make concessions, assuming that you don't press the immediate red button of seceding. We think that you're likely to receive meaningful change in the future. But even in the worst case where you get absolutely nothing, this is far worse than starting up violence and starting up secessionary movements that will cause the lives of the average person in these areas to get substantially worse. At the end of the speech, it is quite clear. Secession is a bloody question, and it's not one we're willing to answer. Negate.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now, moving on to the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case from government bench. Here.
Hello, can I be heard? Yeah, am I audible? All right, awesome. Thank you.
Yes, you are. All good.
Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Malaysia's transition to a higher income economy has placed peninsular Malaysia at the forefront, with the goal of trying to advance industry, trying to diversify the different sectors in which you are involved in. It is by focusing on Kuala Lumpur and the ability of the city to provide wealth to Malaysia that has fundamentally displaced individuals from East Malaysia who are more focused on the natural gas-driven economy. I'm gonna pretty much fixture everything around responses to David and explain why we end up winning each and every individual issue that opening opposition tries to bring up. Number one, they explain that this reliance on natural resources is precisely what they're going to try and care about East Malaysia. The difference here is political incentive, i.e., they care about the resources that you can garner from these regions. They do not necessarily care about how much better that would make it for the people. Because I think it's about 70 to 80% that lives in peninsular Malaysia that all the more explain the lack of political will and political consensus that can be created such that policies that would end up benefiting East Malaysia are impossible. In fact, I'd argue, and there are many examples of this in the past, right? The Kurdish, like within Iraq, have little to no benefit from the oil fields because the national government lays claim to these kinds of industries, these kinds of lands, extracts natural resources themselves, and claims that it's part of their own national territory. And the comparative that Ali sets up is otherwise because the national government could not just do this. They are forced to negotiate with a separate entity. They're forced to negotiate with a separate country, such that the premiums for being able to extract natural gas, being able to export it as part of your own nation, are therefore likely to go to things like tax, likely to go into the pockets of people that live within East Malaysia, rather than fodder for being able to ensure you can boost up the central peninsular Malaysian economy. Secondly, it's cares of businessman. Again, I'd want to note that there is a significant disincentive to prioritize the East Malaysian region precisely because it did not fit into the plan of trying to diversify the economy, move into advanced industry, wherein things like natural gas and logging are probably not the primary drivers of this kind of transition. So I would therefore note that this means there was already not a significant amount of initial investment that had already existed. And a lot of the alternatives that come out from Ali, the first thing I want to note is that if this is just because of the immediate secession, it doesn't explain why this occurs in the long term. A lot of immediate secessions are not necessarily the best, but they don't explain why in the long term they do not improve and therefore become a much more sustainable benefit. But the second thing I want to note is that Ali's alternatives of being able to create your own trade agreements, being able to ensure that you can negotiate on a state-to-state bilateral or multilateral basis is far more likely to be attuned to the needs and wants of the people that live within East Malaysia. So if ever they wanted to set up shop with Indonesia or Brunei that are relatively close countries, they'll be much more able to do so unless, like in status quo, if like Peninsular Malaysia Hello, my Zoom crashed. Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Alright.
You are at 3 minutes, a little bit before 3 minutes. And 3 minutes is when I stopped it. And the last thing I heard about was about setting up trade relations, bilateral and multilateral trade relations. And you were on the sentence after that, which I don't think you finished. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you. So what does this prove? It proves that even if the Peninsular Malaysian economy is powerful, it doesn't explain the distribution of those resources, nor to which degree people are able to benefit from it when you live in East Malaysia. Thirdly, and I hope this takes closing's extension, there's little to no response for political representation and the lack of it. I'd first want to note that these incredibly different colonial histories are incredibly important to be able to take into account because they were not colonized by the British, that many different countries tried to claim this Sabah and Sarawak. What's important to note is one, a significant indigenous population that exists within these regions that are just not very politically popular to cater to, precisely because this is a small demographic and you will not win or lose elections on the basis of what your stance on these kinds of individuals are. And therefore, dedicating more resources for their protection, being able to focus on bills that are going to recognize their rights within constitutions are just not likely to be the case. But secondly, is that even if this is not an economically beneficial kind of trade-off, what I'd want to note is that if individuals are able to clamor for this and vote for this, it's unclear why we ought take on the economic benefit as the primary thing that that these people ought prioritize. When if none of David or if all of David's arguments are true, it is unclear what is the most pressing thing, rather than the broader ability to present a greater degree of political and cultural representation. And I'd want to note that Malaysia, as it exists, is already quite culturally diverse, right? They don't have, it's very difficult to create a strong sense of nationalism due to existing ethnic and cultural differences between people, precisely because as a product of colonization, a lot of individuals moving to Malaysia because of work, a lot of individuals that it's incredibly difficult to be able to create this kind of national identity. And therefore, it's much more likely to focus on the most popular and specific ethnicities that either hold businesses or are numerically more popular, which we have seen in the history of Malaysia, as opposed to individuals that live within East Malaysia. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening up.
But you yourself say that these are a group of people who have specific economic power relative to Malaysia, which is why even if they're a minority, again, as we advanced earlier, there's an incentive to still give them special federated rights that you don't respond to.
No. It is different when you care about people and the actual natural resource they're able to provide. In fact, what I'd like to note is that when you have a national government that lays claim to sovereign territory and says that they can use it for their own businesses, that they can extract the resources themselves, a lot of the extraction happens at the benefit of people within Peninsular Malaysia because they're the ones that are able to do it and benefit from it. And because you are within the same state and share the same territory, the people who benefit from the economic being able to sell off this oil and be able to use it essentially happens in ways that do not benefit the people that actually lives on the land at which this oil is likely to be extracted from. Again, the Kurdish do not benefit from Iraq being able to take on their oil fields. It is just unclear to me why them living in the same area as these natural resources essentially means that they're far more powerful. It makes absolutely no sense. Otherwise, we would not need already existing special provisions for people that will live within Sabah and Sarawak to have more political power if you recognize that they control the government anyway. That is not true. Last true will create the same crisis David says. Insofar as a diplomatic opt-out is possible, it is unclear why in the middle of a pandemic you'd be okay with being able to tolerate some degree of like civil strife. Secondly, responding to violence with violence does not necessarily make less violence. And I'm sure the central or peninsular Malaysian government knows that. And that's precisely why it's unclear why pursuing a degree of all-out war, rather than what we claim to be a degree of diplomatic negotiations concessions that are far more likely to be beneficial. Thirdly, this would only happen if it was still possible to convince Sabah and Sarawak otherwise. In the instance that you know they're going to be seceding regardless, which is what we want to do on opening government, the best thing you can do is build good relations because you still want a degree of good trade deals for their natural resources. You want to ensure that a military on which you have no control anymore cannot possibly respond in retaliation makes it far likely to be good, and therefore it's overwhelming incentives that this is not going to result in some kind of unrealistic all-out war that leader of the opposition thinks it's going to be. For all these reasons, I just think we're a much more realistic team. I am very proud to propose.
Okay, I'd like to thank my speaker for that fine speech. Now to wrap up the opening exchange.
Hello, testing if I'm clear and audible.
Yes, you are. All good.
All right, thank you. PI preference in the chat. I prefer to take one from closing. If there's none, I'll take one from opening gov. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things in this speech. First is to rebut all of the fronts that opening government presented on politics, economic, and cultural identity, and why that it's less important compared to the harms coming from David. Second is conflict and safety. Third is why will the process likely be bad, and why it's bound to get worse in the long term, even if you don't believe any of the short-term harms that David argued in the debate, which still remain standing even after Miko's speech. What are the 3 rebuttals then? The first thing is about politics. They say the demographics are unpopular, but I don't think there's a real harm here when we gave structural reasons for why the Malaysian government doesn't have the incentive to crack down on you. So if the trade-off on this in this debate is sacrificing some level of political representation, as long as there's no active harm and you still gain the benefits of the central Malaysian government giving money to you because they are dependent on your resources, possibly giving you jobs, giving you the opportunity to realize versions of the Malaysian economy. These are all opportunities that further improve your agency as an average citizen, regardless if you care about your cultural identity and all of the historical ties that they talked about earlier. But why is it likely to be, why is violence likely to be popular only if you succeed? And why is the harms coming from David likely? If you're perceived to be a smaller state and the Malaysian government perceives that they're likely to win, the cost of war is unlikely to be grave, and therefore they're likely going to crack down on you. And because of the historical dissent, cracking down of dissent that we have seen, it's likely that the Malaysian government will do this only if you succeed, because you're directly targeting the legitimacy of their government and directly questioning whether or not the Malaysian government is good to you. So in terms of politics, there's no active harm in status quo. The trade-off of some political representation decreasing on our side is still better because you gain the connections of being more jobs and more opportunities and more money on our side of the house. But if you succeed, the likelihood of violence increases on their side. Second rebuttal in terms of the economic benefits and the economic harms that they talk about. The national government, they say, will be forced to negotiate with Sabah and Sarawak when they succeed. This assumes that the negotiation will be favorable, but there are no structural reasons as to why it will likely be so. As Sabah and Sarawak become more desperate for resources for all of the structural reasons David gave to you, because the session is expensive, they're unlikely going to be reasonable in negotiating because they become more desperate for money. And the Malaysian Federation as well is unlikely going to concede to a lot of these unreasonable concerns. So at best, it will take you a long time such that people are already starving by the time you get the deal. But at worst, you're not going to get any deals because the natural resources aren't that rare in Southeast Asia, and the Malaysian Federation has clear alternatives and therefore will unlikely listen to you only if you succeed. Third Third, on cultural identity. How important is this compared to the economic benefits that was pointed out by Closing Gov? The only reason why people can practice their religious rights now and exercise some form of power and agency is because they don't have to concern themselves with their basic needs, don't have to concern themselves with the trade deals that will likely make because they already exist because they are part of Malaysia. The reason why it is okay to trade off your cultural identity, historical roots, compared to the economic benefits we get is that no one from Gov proved how important your cultural roots are. I would say that a lot of the young people within Sabah and Sarawak do not care about these kinds of things compared to the people who cared about them in the past because they're not directly affected by the legacy, but they are affected by starvation, the COVID response, and a lot of the opportunities that we give them on our side of the house. By the end of these responses, in terms of the political will, the economic power, and the cultural identity, a lot of the benefits coming from opening Gov probably are not relevant or probably are unlikely in the debate. First, on conflict and safety. The composition of Southeast Asia today, where strongman leaders rule and where nations are more desperate for resources they claim to be historically theirs, are still rooted in the kinds of leaders and countries that we see. Sabah is still one of the many disputed islands in Southeast Asia that Prime Minister concedes to. And the only reason why there's no active conflict now is because there is the perception of mutually assured destruction, since each country is dealing with another country as well. This dynamic changes if Sabah is not under the control and protection of the Malaysian Federation anymore. So you spark previous historical conflict that would have been dormant on OP, but you have less capacity to combat this on Gov for the fact that you succeed. And this is not an unreasonable claim that there will be war, because I also agree that it's unlikely for war to happen. But this comes in the form of the Philippines, for example, not making trade deals with you, other Southeast Asian countries not being cooperative, actively cracking down on trade against you, even if it's not in the form of active war, because you are using a resource or you're using an area that they thought that historically should be theirs. Again, this doesn't happen on OP because they're fighting against Malaysia and not just some random small area like Sabah and Sarawak, which is comparatively smaller than the bargaining power that we have on opposition side. The next thing I want to talk about is they say terrorism is likely to happen when people are desperate, but government bench has inherent desperation due to secession, because even if the process is slow, as what Prime Minister would like to prop, a lot of people can possibly change their minds and stay in the Malaysian Federation due to the fact that they don't see the solvency of government bench and it seems more risky for them to leave. And moreover, Gov doesn't prove why the people will always choose their cultural and historical identity, which are already irrelevant today, more than the economic safety and assurance they get on opposition. If you decrease in manpower, resources, and potential citizens, you don't get the representative democracy that you want, and you don't have the capacity to survive in the long term as well. The people, therefore, who still choose to secede are worse off because they have less manpower and resources this makes them more likely to resort to equally harmful means like not upholding the rule of law or going to more pernicious actors like China, who's trying to creep itself into Southeast Asia. POI from Closing. OG.
But this does not beat status quo, where there's already a lack of economic investment because they've been left to the wayside because the broader Malaysian project of development. It is under the guise of shared territory that Peninsular Malaysia benefits from the oil and natural gas that East Malaysia doesn't.
So the comparative is worse on your side because you don't prove why the trade deals are likely. I proved why the dormant conflicts within Southeast Asia will prevent you to get the trade deals in the first place, and because the Malaysian Federation is likely to protect their legitimacy because you ruin it on government bench, are unlikely going to give you trade deals as well, especially because the resources aren't really rare and not really like a competitive advantage for that only Sabah and Sarawak can give. Why is it likely to get bound to get worse in the long term? In terms of the economy, you are unlikely going to have the resources to diversify, and as a result, you're more dependent on the natural resources Nico points out in the POI, which is worse because natural resources are volatile. It's bad for economy as well if you're stuck in agriculture. The comparative is simply better, where Malaysia's economy now is at its prime to improve because of deals like RCEP, because of the US-China trade war, and because of the US pivoting to Southeast Asia. We have comparatively higher bargaining power and collective bargaining as well on our side. This significantly benefits even East Malaysia because of all of the opportunities we give them access to, comparatively on Gov, where all of these are gone and people are actively cracking down on Sarawak and Sabah.
Okay, I'd like to thank the speaker for that fine speech. Now to begin the case from the closing house, member of government. Here. Okay, now moving on to the closing opposition. Here.
Hi, can I be heard? Yep, awesome, cool. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Southeast Asia is just literally a geopolitical sea of sharks. And these states leaving to war, which is China. Beyond that, the opening half focuses on the external factors that might mean the state will be successful or might not be successful. But I think this debate and the functioning of this debate must give opening government, the fiat and the reasonable ability to successfully succeed and maybe create some sort of outcomes for them. So the deadlock in opening government and opening opposition on whether they can be economically successful can be best summarized as this. Opening government shows that they have maybe some capacity to be economically successful. Closing government, and opening opposition says maybe not in the short term there will be harms, but obviously the discussion we've had about the choice and political representation, their ability to get some of those benefits directly to themselves, is a problem that opening opposition have yet to answer. It follows, and I'm going to talk to you about two things. Firstly, why this new state will be politically unstable given the unique characterization that maybe has already been mentioned but not actually used by the opening half, and then secondly, why China will sink their teeth in. Note that these two extensions together show that even the best case of government side, when there is infrastructure development and organization of that economic capacity that these states may have, is not going to the people. It's likely going to create more tensions and more conflict, unique from what we heard from opening opposition. But before I get into that, right, and a lot of this obviously inherently responds to closing government and opening up government, because it's just a way up as to what is going to be worse to the individuals on the ground. Just want to talk before that as to what the comparative is. So a lot of the analysis we just heard from, and echoing opening government, but the most precise analysis we heard from closing government as to all the harmful things that the Peninsular Malaysia currently does to these states, is very confusing for I guess also for opening opposition, right? Because it's not it's about the negotiations and the process it takes to actually do that secession. So the fiat and the ability for government side to actually remove themselves completely from the state obviously means that opposition as a bench has the ability to do something similar, but maybe not the exact same thing and maybe not to that exact same extent. So the kinds of devolution of power and authority that we support as a group on opposition is likely to succeed on our side as well, given the ability in face of all those harms for them to do it on their side of the house. Why is this though going to be relatively symmetric in terms of the harms posed by closing government, right? So the first thing is obviously if you have a devolution of power and local representation to a great extent, you have a lot of institutional support and ability because you have connections to Peninsular Malaysia, but Peninsular Malaysia isn't able to do the kinds of things that closing government just described in terms of affecting their control over the economy, but also their control over who gets to vote and who gets into power. So it's much better representation that Peninsular Malaysia can't actually go in and do as much as they did in the status quo. But that also means they can't form and control, because giving privileges as described by closing government is also out of their ability if that level of devolution happens. So they need to be more precise as a government bench and explain why the specific difference of succession is the unique thing that is going to provide the kinds of outcomes they want to talk about. Into the extension right now. Firstly, this new state is going to be politically incapable. So first thing to note here is that it's likely that the political parties and political institutions of this new state will be inept for several reasons, right? So in the status quo, you don't necessarily have that kind of political representation, and that has been largely conceded by everyone in this debate as to how politics works in those areas. The kinds of parties that are in those states are likely focused on that identity and on that opposition, and the voters there obviously also vote on that single issue, given the kind of tensions as about secession as they're talking about. This looks like Ireland in the status quo. What this means, so firstly, given closing government that they have been manipulated and probably don't trust the voting process. Secondly, in general, people just need a little bit of period to understand which parties are likely, especially the new parties forming, in order to have an opposition in that area, are going to cater to them. There's going to be a lot of confusion in the short term, but these parties have not developed policies to actually run a state, but there are also few institutions in terms of having opposition party and local reporting on that, given that these elections weren't that important in the status quo. But also the individuals that are in power right now and likely remain in power are likely more extreme, as it was a single issue elections. Elections weren't as important as before, and media institutions were weak. Secondly, terrorist groups in these areas were based on the idea of secession and hatred towards the Peninsular Malaysia. And now they're emboldened given the secession they have support, they have economic ties there, and likely these terrorist groups are likely going to but also likely to be very violent in terms of an extreme in their messaging. That plus less mechanisms for accountability means you are likely going to have very corrupt institutions in place. The outcome is like you have a fractured government that it's hard to fix the kind of power sharing that has suddenly been created, but also a new state is required to show success and a capacity to their people. So they're likely to be very short-termist in catering those individuals. That benefits populist bad governments. The impact of this is they're unable to do the things that opening government needs to do, that opening opposition says, hey, you might not be able to do. We actually mechanize that for you, but also you're more likely to get corruption. This responds to opening government, right? Because you're unlikely to get the meaningful political representation that they so care about, or economic flourishing, because now you have your own government and more corrupt government extracting from your people. I'll take a point from opening government before I move on.
So I agree. Devolution deals with a lot of the manipulation problems from CG. But what we explain is that territorial separation, bilateral trade, and military independence are unique to secession and are long-term rather than these short-term single-voter issues that you're talking about.
No, agreed. But the problem is that the short-term conditions that I just described results in long-term economic extraction by corrupt governments, but also harms when it comes to China. It's unclear how that is destroyed in China. So firstly, why does China care about this new state? Firstly, there are incentives in that region, right? The BRI is both an economic corridor for trade, but also military bases, and you need an uninterrupted route to actually use that properly. Malaysia, they tried it there. There was literally a coup with the whole 1MDB scandal, and Malaysia and Mahathir reneged on those loans. So a new country in that location is making China lick their lips, but it's also politically unstable, as I've already just justified. What do they do then? Firstly, they have Chinese disinformation. People are poor, but they have access to Facebook as the main source of news for those individuals. It's free with their data plan, and sort of small thing, right? That's what they do in Taiwan. They will stoke hatred between ethnic groups in the area, stoke hatred against Peninsular Malaysia, but also have propaganda politically to the favorable politicians. That means that you get a lot more tension, not based on the internal assumptions made by opening opposition, but by very guaranteeable external influences, even in the government ventures best case. But you also get debt traps, right? And that means that you actually lose all the benefits you're talking about, because Chinese laborers come in, they take over your ports as collateral, which means you don't even get to use the very useful maritime ports that closing control over the infrastructure that the government bench cares about, but they're also stuck in debt. That means they're unable to help their people in the long term. The closing opposition case is a reasonable case based on the best case that government brings to you, side with closing opposition.
Okay, I'd like to thank next speaker for that fine speech. Now, to conclude the case from the government bench, I'd like to invite the government here.
Cool. I assume I am audible. Just a moment. Cool. Okay, we'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. My speech will be very simple. First, responding to closing opposition, then explaining why our extension wins the debate, before finally dealing with some residual opening half issues. Firstly, let's look at what CO tells us. I think CO has a very infantilizing case. Basically, their first state will be hugely inept. I think the thing to point out, it's not as if when you secede, you lose like all institutional memory. The reason why current governance is weak at the moment is because the central government obviously fucks around with those regions and, for example, cuts funding and those sorts of things. So yes, at the point where you secede, you'll probably need some period of time in order to establish yourself, but you don't forget how democracy works. You just borrow and replicate those structures and strengthen with time. Then I think I'm a bit confused, but I think they have a point about like the types of representation that will necessarily be demanded in that state. I mean, like that is fine. Like if people want representation from certain groups and ultimately elect them to serve in those parliaments or whatever those structures look like, then that is fine with us. I just don't understand at all why that is a problem. The final claim they seem to make is one about China, and China will like come in and wreck everything. Firstly, I would observe, I think you need to be somewhat comparative to the status quo, which is what Enting explained is already kind of happening at the moment with respect to the central government. But also, I would just observe that, like, you know, maybe it's for these to negotiate and they can do those things. Importantly, now they have the choice of various different investment opportunities. Do they want to engage with the Malaysian central government? Would they prefer to have a trade deal with China? Or indeed, would they prefer to sell all of their oil resources to Western states? The choice now exists for them. They do not have that choice under the status quo where their policy is largely dictated by the central government. I just really do not see why this is a problem at all. Also, I would just point out that China is like historically engaging in less of this type of activity nowadays. Okay, let's move on to our extension. What does Enting explain to you? I think three very important contributions, like with huge amounts of examples and specificity throughout. The first is just to say that there are actual important differences between central Malaysia and Sabah and Sarawak beyond just, you know, an assertion about colonial history. The fact that there is hugely different racial and religious backgrounds that exist in those states. For example, the fact that there's a huge Chinese population. For example, the fact that Christianity is a religion that is practiced in a huge amount. And the reason why that is important is because of the huge racial and religious divisions that not only exist as a matter of course in Malaysia, but are often strung up, you know, as a deliberate political issue by the Malaysian government. And this is people active in line by stealing resources, by blocking trade routes, by manipulating politics. Huge amount of examples and specificity that comes from Enting. And more than that, the government is weak at the moment, so this is the best time to secede. What do we get in response? Opening opposition says a couple things. They say people don't really care that much about their identity. They prioritize economic issues. But I think all of the context we give you explains that people do, right? Like, think about how people prioritize religion. They believe that is core to their identity, their capacity to reach salvation. I think a lot of people care about that more than just like, what is the marginal amount of funding that my state gets and stuff like that. People fucking do care about this. Then they say, well, if you are weak, that is the perfect time to negotiate. But no, there's a difference. Even if you're a weak central government, it is still relatively easy to, for example, stack a local election in Sabah. But what is harder to do if you're weak is, one, wage war, which seemed to be the contention of opening opposition, or number two, for example, outcompete the newly formed East Malaysian state on a trade deal. Those are things that are a lot harder to do when you're weak versus what you can do relatively now. And the final thing, CG to give autonomy, and this will solve engage with external. What is the one? It would be nice if we could. That is really distracting. Their case is that not only are different interests not being catered for, our case is no, they are actively being fucked at the moment. And specifically, the urgency is that this has to happen now, given the time frame that we're describing. Number two, I think we give you far more plausibility beyond opening government why you would in fact prioritize your identity over things like economic benefits if you believe O wins the front half clash on this. But also, I think we win on a vulnerability metric. That is to say that we've given you evidence about the fact that people, for example, who come from a Chinese minority in Malaysia are actively being persecuted, and this helps them self-actualize. Before I continue on, does OO have a POI?
Yeah, so again, this assumes the process of secession occurs, and because it happens, we can negotiate from the outside. But the process of secession is what is likely the worst in the sabotaging that you're saying happens.
Do it for a little bit, but then once they say if you're reliant, that means you'll give more concessions. Opening government gives, I think, a bit of a confusing response here about they don't care about people. I would just observe, number one, if they are wanted to give concessions, they probably would already. Number two, it's kind of like a carrot or a stick thing. The reason why the central government does not have to give concessions is because they can just apply the stick approach, right? Like if you have power, you can just exhort it in that sense. And thirdly, I think the key difference is you can't get external allies on board with concessions when this is seen as an internal issue. Then they talk about economic costs. They talk about refinery cost, foreign investment fleeing, and the central government will outcompete you. I would just say that number one, the revenue you're probably likely to make from like owning your own oil supply probably outweighs any like marginal cost in refinery costs. Number two, this assumes you will do it in the worst possible way, like by not announcing your trade policy to foreign actors. Number three, you'll probably have a competitive advantage over the mainland. For example, the fact that you're poorer probably means you can pay people lower wages. And as we've already explained, identity is more important to a lot of people. Violence is probably unlikely to occur at the point where you're literally over the fucking border. I think on all of these metrics, CG win this debate.
Okay, I'd like to thank that speaker for that fine speech. Now to wrap up the debate as a whole, I'd like to invite the opposition with here.
I think the problem with the speech that we just heard was because the amount of autonomy that you can have as an area is relative and exists on a spectrum, right? Where we draw the line at CO is we tell you that it is possible to give the Sarawak and Sabah people autonomy internally through a process of devolution, but preventing external autonomy, of which makes them targets for aggressive countries like China. That's a massive harm and something that was obviously not grasped before us in the speech before us at CG, right? Two big areas in this debate. Firstly, on like sabotage and economics, and secondly, on politics and identity. Firstly, on sabotage and economics. What we hear at CG is that like there's significant sabotage that's occurring from Malaysia. They stop maritime trade routes, they alter voter profiles, and that's really harmful. The issue here is that's not quite comparative with what happens at the point that this area does secede, right? Because we tell you at the point that it does secede, China takes over the maritime trade route and makes it really difficult for them to like import it exactly the way they want to get the maximum benefit out of their economic resources. And China probably also tries to alter the voting profile, right? They probably also want to get patsies in there who want to support China and want to angle it towards that. They don't get this representation for the vulnerable indigenous groups they talk about because of that fact. Because of that fact. And note that they almost have to turn to China, because it's just not true that they have all of these alternatives that they can pick between, because when you immediately secede, you're left in an extremely vulnerable position. You're left in a position where suddenly you have to clamor together and reestablish and try and legitimize your institutions. You're stuck in a position where you don't have natural trading allies because they are all warded off by the Malaysian peninsula state, right? They tell us that you cannot, CG further tells us that you can't succeed in getting any negotiation within the country because of like stacking politicians and withholding resources and those sorts of things. But those are solved by devolution. The response that we hear to devolution, which was very minimal, is just that like, like you can't get it because there's a stick approach. like the stick approach response runs into the symmetry problem, which is that if Malaysia is going to crack down on you, they're going to crack down on you either way. And then the second thing they tell us is it's seen as an internal issue, so other countries stay away. It's probably still seen as an internal issue if you try to secede, and Malaysia in the Malaysian Peninsula tells everyone that that's an illegitimate, secession. I think that the real response here is given at Shah, which is to say that if that this debate operates on a level of fiat that's given to opening government, we tell you that comparative level of fiat means that it is highly likely that it like basically guaranteed that we're likely to get a level of devolution of which is likely to resolve a lot of the issues without of the harm. Because when they tell us it gives a Sabah and Sarawak choice, that choice is a guise. The issues of stealing resources happen under every team in this debate except ours, which gives them devolution over internal resources. They tell us that they can make concessions to appear economically viable. That's like that CG tells us that to try and in order to like mechanize OG's material on bilateral trade and unlocking the value of the resources. But like again, as Shah tells you in extension, the fact that you're a fresh state opens you up to exploitation. The fact that China is likely to be extremely willing to help you set up political systems. The fact that they're likely to be extremely willing to help donate you things like free internet, of which is rife with Chinese disinformation. They're likely to help you build white elephant projects that aren't useful for you, but are only useful for China. Yeah. On politics and identity then, but before that, I'll take a POI from OG.
But the problem with all benches, no one deals with status quo. Only secession can solve incredibly bad bilateral negotiations, the redistribution of national funds to increase investment in these areas, or the ability to enshrine in constitutions political rights that we explain have been robbed of Sabah and Sarawak.
I also think that you don't listen to Shah's extension, which is to say when you get devolution, that allows relative autonomy within the area. It allows you to do things like set up local elections for local governments that are run by you that can't be interfered with the Malaysian Peninsula. It allows you to do things forge your own identity or like choose like avenues and what economic policies you want to enter into. On politics and identity, right? As Shah tells you at extension, secession requires a great deal of setup of institutions. The issue with this power sharing agreement that no one seems to want to acknowledge in this debate, the reason it's unlikely to work is it's because it's created by a lot of different groups with relative power imbalances, with extremely different goals, with extremely different backgrounds. Even though they're different from Malaysia, that's not to say everyone within East Malaysia is homogenous. They're not. They have extremely different incentives that are unlikely to be able to be aligned, especially in the instance when they're a new state, right? The responses that we get are things like, oh, there's institutional memory. That institutional memory doesn't exist because because of the Malaysian control. It doesn't respond to what Shah says. But we also tell you it leaves you susceptible to a lot of foreign influence. But like, also to note, because the comparative at CO wasn't the status quo, it was devolution. We tell you that autonomy, we tell you that we get the spectrum of autonomy that's really, really important, which means that we claim a lot of the benefits of the government side, but we don't sacrifice those the economic harms. Finally, on cultural identity, because this was another push that we hear at CG, right? But we tell you that the conditions of secession means that you have to necessarily compromise a lot of your cultural identity in ways that they obviously don't want to engage with. Things like requiring foreign direct investment, things like requiring maybe foreign nationals move into your country, all harms the profile of the cultural identity of your area. We tell you also then the fact that there are incentives for other countries to stoke racial division is another harmful thing. But why is being a part of established Malaysia good? Because we tell you get insulated from the harms of China. You get to keep a lot of the systems that exist, but with the benefits of devolution, we tell you that you're able to reclaim your identity and prevent a lot of the harms that are outlined at government.
Okay, I'd like to thank all speakers for what was an excellent debate. I'm not entirely sure about the process for the discussion here. I'd like to invite everyone to digitally cross the floor and shake hands, of course.